Why is Ambassador Arturo Valenzuela's family name Valenzuela rather than Venezuela? What are the origins of the country name Venezuela? And for that matter, what are the origins of the name Valenzuela? Our distinguished guests will reveal the answers to those and other trenchant questions today. But before we turn to Ambassadors Philip Hughes and Secretary Arturo Valenzuela for our substantive program, which will be a tour d'horizon of South America, including the politico-economic impacts of the coronavirus pandemic. I'm Tim Chorba, President of the Council of American Ambassadors. Let me welcome you all to the Council of American Ambassadors' initial foray into our roundtable programming via Zoom in the brave new world of coronavirus. The Council's staff members, Executive Director Kathleen Sheehan and Communications Director Keisha King, have labored diligently to master the somewhat complex technology required for a Zoom production and are at the controls behind the scenes this morning. We're delighted that joining today's program from around the country are you Council members whom I'll name momentarily. I'll identify your home states and the countries to which you were posted if they are located on the mainland south of the Rio Grande. So we have with us today, close to the Rio Grande, but north thereof, Ambassador Arthur Schechter in Houston, Ambassador Brenda Johnson in New York, Ambassador Bruce Heyman in Chicago, Ambassador Charlie Glazer, presumably in Connecticut, Ambassadors Sue and Chuck Cobb in Coral Gables, Ambassador George Bruno in New Hampshire, who served in Belize, Ambassador Gilbert Robinson from the District of Columbia, Ambassador Jim Rosa Pepe in Maryland, who is an active member, sitting member of the Maryland State Senate, Ambassador Lori Fulton in Alexandria, Virginia, Rita Saltzman is in New York City, Ambassador Bob Mandel is in Florida, Ambassador Tom Siebert is here in the District of Columbia, Ambassador Richard Holwell, who's been transplanted from Louisiana to the District of Columbia, served in Ecuador, Ambassador April Foley is up in New York State, and Ambassador Barry White joins us today from Boston. Also with us this morning are three alumni of our Annenberg Fellows program. Luke Zarrow, who is clerking with the U.S. Court of Appeals in Ohio, Rosa Kupari, who is in graduate school at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, and Donna Amadi, who is finishing her first year, likely remotely, at the University of Virginia Law School. With that, let me turn the podium over to the Council's Senior Vice President, Ambassador Philip Hughes, who, while having served in Barbados and the Caribbean, is blessed with a formidable fluency in Spanish and a profound knowledge of South America. Ambassador Hughes.
Thank you, Tim. It's my pleasure this morning to introduce our special guest, former Assistant Secretary of State for Western Hemisphere Affairs, Dr. Arturo Valenzuela. The origin of this program actually began last October when, as you may recall, around the time that Argentina was electing a new government, protests erupted in capitals across South America. Surprisingly, in some of the nations with the most successful economies and most successful records of improving the lot of their citizens economically and socially. In Santiago, Chile, for example, or in Bogota, Colombia, where one of Latin America's most successful economies was also overcoming, through a peace program, a half century of civil violence. Protests erupted in Quito, Ecuador. In Bolivia, these protests overthrew the socialist government of Evo Morales and replaced it with an interim government that's still struggling to elect a permanent successor government. The circumstances of each of these protests were different. The particulars varied, but that they coincided was unmistakable. As it happens, our special guest this morning has been consulted by the governments affected by this violence at the end of last year and earlier this year, and before the coronavirus shut down transport worldwide, has had firsthand experience of what was in fact propelling this region-wide phenomena in Latin America. But in the meanwhile, October seems a million years away in coronavirus terms, and a new challenge has swept over Latin America as a region, just as it has the rest of the world, and that is coping with the coronavirus pandemic. I can think of no one better qualified or better positioned to address these and other recent developments in Latin America than Dr. Arturo Valenzuela. Currently, the Senior International Affairs Advisor for Latin America at the law firm of Covington and Burling, Arturo has served, as I mentioned, as former Assistant Secretary of State for Western Hemisphere Affairs for most of President Obama's first term. And since most of us, or many of us participating this morning in this webinar, have served in the Western Hemisphere, more in the Caribbean than in Central or South America, we're all familiar with the Assistant Secretary for Western Hemisphere Affairs as our day-to-day boss, I guess you might say, in those posts. But prior to that service, Arturo served in President Clinton's administration as the Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director of the National Security Council staff for Latin American Affairs, and prior to that in President Clinton's first term as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Western Hemisphere Affairs. In between and prior to Arturo's government service, he was Professor of Political Science and International Relations at Georgetown University and the founder and director of Georgetown's Center for Latin American Studies. He's now Professor Emeritus at Georgetown from those roles. And before joining the Georgetown faculty in 1987, he served as Professor of Political Science and head of the Council for Latin American Studies at Duke University. With that kind of background, there's no one better to share with us the latest on Latin America's various challenges. And with that, I turn the podium over to my friend and colleague, Arturo Valenzuela.
Well, thank you very, very much for this introduction. It's my pleasure to be able to join you virtually. I hope that my skylight doesn't get too bright with the sun that comes over, but occasionally clouds will give me some dispensation so that I'll be able to be less illuminated as we go through this conversation. Let me start out by making a couple of observations regarding the coronavirus crisis. There's simply, this is affecting the entire world, as we know at this particular point. And the issues of public health are really very serious everywhere, although it's impacted some countries more than others. I've recently had an opportunity to discuss the issue with the Secretary General of the Pan American Health Organization and others. Haiti, for example, is really suffering from the situation very, very severely. And there's no country probably that's going to be impacted as much as Venezuela itself. And I'm going to mention Venezuela shortly at the top of this discussion, because I think we really need to sort of focus on the fact that it is set apart. But beyond the public health crisis, we've heard a lot of commentary about the interruption of industrial production chains and value chains and so on and so forth. For Latin America, more generally, the real problem is, in fact, the disruption as well of the entire world economy, including the export from Latin America of commodities like copper and petroleum and soybeans and other things like that of course have ground to a halt, adding additional distress to economies that are also quarantined, where you have So this could have an impact. Latin America, was on a very good trajectory before the Great Depression. Things were looking fairly good, and then the Great Depression came, and that's when much of the institutional development of the country came to a grinding halt. And let's hope that maybe we won't be seeing the same sort of thing at this particular point. Let me, however, clarify at the top of this conversation that the phenomenon that we've been looking at is different in countries. I want to stress that because there's been an assumption that there are commonalities. Of course, there's certain kinds of common strains. But Latin American Politics 101 was always a class about how, in fact, we should not discuss the countries in the region as being all sort of equal. They have different trajectories, different histories, different backgrounds, and so on and so forth. Some were able to consolidate democratic institutions at a very early stage. Others are not. There really is a very significant difference between the countries of the Caribbean and the rest of Latin America. When I served first in the State Department as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Clinton administration, I was in charge of the relation with Mexico. It was the American Republics area. That was the name of the bureau at the time. It became WHA later, when that bureau in the State Department that puts acronyms on things, goes to work. I'm kidding about that, obviously. But why did it become Western Hemisphere area? Because the Caribbean and Canada actually were passed on into the Bureau of the American Republics area, and they weren't republics. So there really are some really significant differences in the background of those particular countries. But to get to the point of what we want to share today, let's underscore the fact that there are some real differences in the crisis that came before even the pandemic arrived in countries like Venezuela, Colombia, Bolivia, Ecuador, and so on. In the case of Venezuela, we see the most catastrophic collapse of an economy, of a country, of a political system in Latin America, probably since the 19th century, when Paraguay was destroyed, practically literally, in the War of the Triple Alliance, where 50% of the population, male population of the country, died. It's unfathomable to think of a country that was the highest in per capita income in Latin America, not too long ago, is essentially collapsed. And we can have some conversation about that later on, or some questions if you want to. The crisis in Colombia, is different from the one in Chile or in Bolivia, because in some ways too, you have the challenge in Colombia of the peace process that has not been fully concluded. And so the elements of the peace process are there as well. And the crisis in Bolivia responded to a bad election, in an election that was documented as being fraudulent by the Organization of American States, president that had actually been prohibited from running yet for another term, and yet decided to do so, and so on and so forth. And then, if you take a country like Guyana, where there's a real crisis right there, the crisis is driven by something that's not necessarily the case in Latin American countries, and that is a very sharp division between ethnic populations in the country itself. If I might make one point on this score right now, if there's something positive about Latin America, is that it's probably the only continent in the world where you don't have what the Italians call irredentist politics, irredenta, which means that subalternate loyalties trump, so to speak, national identities. You have that in the Caribbean, Indians versus Afro descendants and others. But in the rest of the Latin America, you don't necessarily have this phenomena of subalternate loyalties, whether they are ethnic, whether they're religious, whether they're regional, or so on and so forth, actually attempting to establish themselves as a sovereign nation state. That is that is the fundamental problem in the 21st century right now in countries all over the world, including, of course, the rebirth of these subalternate loyalties in places like Europe, Catalonia, and so on and so forth. So that is, a good thing for Latin America. But I just want to put that parenthesis in there, with the exception of Caribbean. Ironically, also with the exception of Canada, there really have not been these sort of irredentist demands. I still remember de Gaulle when he went to Canada and he yelled, "Vive le Québec libre!" Quite some time ago. Latin America is a continent then of fairly consolidated nation states, even though the tragedy of Latin America is that it has not been able to consolidate institutions in a very strong way. The end of the Cold War, however, gave us a tremendous promise. There was a really significant shift. It was the first time in the history of Latin America that you had the development and the consolidation really of democratic institutions across the board. What you had was, with the exception of Chile, really, and Uruguay, and later on Costa Rica, the consolidation of democratic institutions had always been a work in progress, and it had not really gone that well. As I said earlier, right before the Great Depression, there seemed to be a very, very significant and promising period. I wrote a chapter for the Cambridge History on Latin America, on the evolution of democratic institutions and democracies in Latin America with Jonathan Hartland at the University of North Carolina. And we covered all that period. But the Great Depression put the kibosh on a lot of the institutional progress that was being made. And from the 1930s until the 1980s, 40% of all changes of government were through military coups. And then when what some scholars called the bureaucratic authoritarian period came in, which came essentially after the overthrow of Frondizi in Argentina in '63, and then the military coup in Brazil in '64, you really had these military establishments running most of the countries in the region. There are only 3 countries that avoided these bureaucratic authoritarian regimes during that period. Actually, there are 4 countries, if you include Mexico, which did not have a military government, but it was still pretty authoritarian. Ironically, the 3 were Colombia, Venezuela, and Costa Rica. And they came up with some elite pacts that helped them prevent that, but everywhere else. And the 2 countries, perhaps with the longest trajectories of democracy, were Chile and Uruguay, and they, of course, also succumbed during the period of the Cold War to this bureaucratic authoritarian military rule during this period of time. So that was, something. But with the end of the Cold War, again, we set out on a new trajectory. If you look at the progress today, only in 3 countries have changes of government, or in 2 countries have changes of government been through classic military coups, twice in Haiti and once in Ecuador. So, things have been, however, and I'll get to this a little bit later again, 19 presidents now have not been able to finish her or their terms and have had to resign. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. The other thing that did happen with the end of the Cold War was also that the people realized that the import substitution industrialization model, which meant high tariffs and try to create the industries locally, was simply not working out. And that led to the lost decade of the 1980s in Latin America. And what we found was that with the end of the military rule and so on, you got also the opening of these economies, and that tended to be a very positive thing. Tariff barriers were brought down. You had free trade agreements being signed with the United States and other countries, and the opening of these economies did lead not only to a period of significant progress in democratic rule, but at the same time also led to phenomenal expansion of economic activity, which led to a really significant decline in absolute poverty levels. So those are these two phenomena: the shifts in economic policy, partly driven also by the United States. It was the U.S. effort, what it was called the Washington Consensus, to try to sort of get away from these protected economies of the import substitution industrialization variety that led to this sort of thing. So that was the good news was there. Of course, we face now something else, and let me get to that, because that's really the key of what I've been asked to talk about. How come then have we suddenly seen the outbreak in countries, including Chile, which had probably the longest lasting democracy in all of Latin America. In fact, only 15 months of outright unconstitutional rule in Chile from the 1830s until the coup of 1973. That doesn't mean that the suffrage was expanded early on. No, it took a long time. That doesn't mean that there wasn't, women didn't have the right to vote until much later. Yes, that's the case. But if you compare it with European countries, in fact, Chile was really very much on par with the evolution of democratic institutions. So what happened? How come after the collapse of the Pinochet government, the defeat of the Pinochet government, and things going in the right direction, what happened? And here what we might say is, in fact, I wrote an article called Problems of Success in Chile. In some ways, the problems are due also to the fact that there was a lot of success. And the most important success, and I want to stress this because I think there's been a really significant misinterpretation in much of the media discussions of these sorts of things. The narrative is, oh, well, the countries have become much more unequal. The Gini coefficients have, gone south, that in fact, expanding the economies, the Washington Consensus, the neoliberal policies, as some people call, were mistaken. And we therefore have a situation of much greater inequality. That's simply not true. That's simply not true. In country after country after country, extreme poverty went way, way down. And to take the case of Chile that I'm going to spend a little bit of time on now, in Chile in 1960, when I came to the United States, about 53% of the population lived in extreme poverty, Today it's 8%, so it really is not true that in fact there's a greater inequality. What's happened is that the success, and this is the point of the problems of success, led to the creation and to the emergence of a new middle class, people who didn't have an opportunity before, whose parents didn't even have floors in their houses or bathrooms in their homes, or their grandparents lived essentially in the countryside and weren't even aware of what was going on in the rest of the country. This new middle class then, is one that's striving, that has a lot of ambitions, and yet it is found, and this is where there's a lot of commonality with other countries, that a lot of their hopes and expectations have been shattered, or they live with vulnerability. They're vulnerable, Okay, you finally were able to buy that taxi cab, and but you couldn't afford the insurance, and when you bought the taxi cab and you had a job and so on and so forth, you finally got the little house and you're paying a lot on the mortgage, but everything's going okay because you have a lot of clients, because Chile has become a really important destination for tourists. But then you have an accident, and that's the end, and you feel like you're. In fact, if I might put my academic hat back on again, there's this really very influential book by Eric Wolf, an eminent anthropologist, called Peasant Wars of the 20th Century, where he looks back at the great revolutions of the 20th century in places like Vietnam, in Algeria, in Cuba, and other places like that. It's not the poorest peasants that were revolting. It was, as he pointed out, the middle peasants that were more affected by the changes in industrial agriculture and things like that. So they're the ones that were driving this sort of thing. So what we find then in country after country in Latin America is the frustration of sectors that finally thought that they will be able to make some progress. And if you add to that another dimension, is that we also live in a world where people are much more aware of how other people live. And we also live in a world where people are much more prone to conspicuous consumption. When my dad used to take the train to vote and wore his suit in Chile because that was a civic duty and so on and so forth, it was a country where people, frowned upon conspicuous consumption. The guy who showed up with a big car was somebody who was laughing at the poor, and that was just not appropriate. There was a long there was a tradition of, that's gone by the wayside. People well. So add to that, the instant communications, the social media, the access to television and so on, people realize that other people really are living much better off than they are. And so this is what led to this amazing development that took place in Chile, where suddenly the government countenanced the increase in subway fares, a very small amount. And you had students all over the streets. People try to jump into the subways and so on and so forth. They were affected because they felt like they were at a potential margin and didn't want to fall back. And other people took advantage of it too. So you got a significant, frustration, manifested. And at the outset, the government did not handle it well. It said we're at war with, if you can't make your bus in the morning, take two, get up earlier, and so on and so forth. And that led to a significant backlash at that time. So the country faces a rather difficult situation because of this. Now, the parties have come together. And they had proposed that, in fact, maybe we ought to do a constitutional change. Maybe there ought to be some way of getting this. But I'll end with this point, and that's, where are the parties in Latin America? They've collapsed everywhere. In other words, people are frustrated by the inaction. I said that 19 presidents did not finish their terms, partly because they did not have majorities in the Congress. And so this is a subject that I'm not going to get into now. This is where there's a crisis of presidentialism in Latin America, where you don't have safety valves that you find in a parliamentary form of government, where if for some reason a president can't govern because he simply cannot get anything through Congress, you actually call a new election or something like that. This has led to significant complications and difficulties. But the most dramatic thing of all is the collapse of the identification of parties. When I was writing my first books on Chile before the military coup, what was really astonishing about a country like Chile or Uruguay and so on was the strong party identification of most of the citizens. Everybody had a party that they belonged to. And people also responded, to when they were asked, well, what are you, left, right, or center? They would say, yes, I am left, I'm right, I'm center. Today, 8% of the population, as opposed to 75% of the population, doesn't even say that they have any kind of identification with parties. It's happened in Mexico too, where the parties were not, where you only had a one-party system for a long period of time. People just don't think that they count. And with that, we have then, and I'll end with this, a real crisis of representation, which has also been aggravated in some countries by a crisis of accountability, which is the corruption that we've heard about a lot in other countries, where fortunately, the judicial systems have been pushing back on that, the Odebrecht scandal and things like that. And then finally, those two things, the crisis of representation and the crisis of accountability, has led to a crisis of governance. And today, if we face the shades of the Great Depression again and all of this, we really are in a very bad moment. And unfortunately, this promise that Fukuyama also talked about at one particular point when he talked about the end of history, unfortunately has come to somewhat disappointing end, and who knows where we are in this particular context. So I'll stop there, and I'd be delighted to answer any questions or try to enter into a dialogue or conversation with you. So thanks so much for this invitation. I'm very grateful for it.
Well, Arturo, thank you for an outstanding, thank you for an outstanding presentation this morning, this afternoon. We're very grateful for you making the time for that. I neglected, unfortunately, at the beginning to remind participants that it's very easy to ask questions here and pose them for Arturo. If you have a computer and simply mouse over the video picture, you'll see a menu pops up, I think typically at the bottom of the screen, with an option Q&A. Click on it, or if you're using a tablet, use your finger to touch the screen and the menu will appear. Touch the Q&A button and type out your question. It'll appear in a question queue, and I'll be able to read them to Dr. Valenzuela and give him a chance to answer. So while participants are entering their questions, I hope, let me ask Arturo a question to get us going. You ended on the note, of course, of the coronavirus and the challenges that's going to pose to economies all over the Western Hemisphere, including our own, and what an open question, a very fertile area to talk about what that might mean for that proverbial taxi driver you mentioned, who just got, even before the crisis, just got to the cusp of success and then perhaps by accident or whatever seemed to fall backwards. But I'd like to ask a different question about parties. Colombia was perhaps the nation or one of two nations in Latin America that had the longest running and most stable two-party system between the liberals and the conservatives. But now, post-Uribe, the president who, after his terms of office, successfully basically beat back the insurgency and created the conditions in which his successor could negotiate a peace plan with the FARC guerrillas, that two-party system, that stable two-party system, has come undone. Maybe you could focus a little bit on Colombia as a case study here for us about how a two-party system, a long-running stable two-party system, comes apart in Latin America.
Well, you know, I mentioned in my talk earlier that Colombia, along with Venezuela and Costa Rica, were the three countries that avoided the military rule. The fourth country that avoided military rule was Mexico, but Mexico, of course, was an authoritarian state, so it was not. One of the reasons that Venezuela and Colombia avoided that was that there was a strong pact put together by the elites on both, you know, coming together. And you were right to note that in Colombia, the great divide historically was between liberals and conservatives. In fact, many of the civil wars in Colombia were fought by liberals versus conservatives, you know, because each party was trying to find its way to have sort of absolute power. But when they got together. This is after the beginning of the Cold War, and they put together a national front. They basically divided all power completely among them. And in the same way that the Pacto de Punto Fijo in Venezuela divided power between the various different parties. But when they did that, it was sort of an elite arrangement that left out a lot of other sectors. And so there was this sort of pent up demand. And that encouraged a lot of the sort of, guerrilla movements and other things like that in Venezuela. You know, the contrast of the Colombian political system was dramatic. For example, if you compare it with the Chilean one, because in the Colombian political system you had liberals and conservatives, but you really didn't have anybody really on the far left or on the left. Whereas the Chilean political system was one that evolved way back, at the beginning of the 20th century, when the founder of the Communist Party was actually elected to the Senate before the Russian Revolution. And so you had a political system, a party system that was much more akin to some of the European party systems as they evolved later on, where there was a strong socialist and Communist Party on the left, and then center parties, radical and Christian Democrats in the center, and then liberals and conservatives on the right. And that allowed then for a far more inclusive democratic system to work itself through. As I mentioned, that also has collapsed. But in Colombia, if we go back to your point directly, people are rejecting the establishment parties. In fact, there's a new mayor of Bogota now, and her party is the Green Party, so you. And the alliance that you used to have between at times conservatives and liberals has faltered as well. So there is kind of a fragmentation of the party system in that sense. The danger when party systems collapse like this is that people then look for a savior. People look for a savior. I don't believe in my party anymore. Who's going to come up? I hate parties. We all hate parties. And parties are all corrupt or whatever. And then let's look for a savior. And then when saviors come around, guess what saviors do? They destroy institutions even more. They go after the Supreme Court. They want to get themselves reelected. They want to do all this sort of stuff. And that's kind of a pattern that you see both on the right and on the left in Latin America, maybe in Brazil and maybe in Mexico at this point.
Thank you, Arturo. Very helpful. The first question, apart from my own, from our other participants, comes to us from Ambassador Chorba, who asks simply, could you tell us what the Cubans are up to in South America these days?
Well, look, I owe Ambassador Chorba also the response to his question, and I'll take advantage of the fact that I have and the clouds have moved over my skylight here, so I feel like I'm not totally illuminated. And he asked me what the etymology of my last name is, Valenzuela. How come it sounds like Venezuela? And the answer is a very simple one, and that is that Huela is a diminutive in Spanish, small, petite, the little things, and so when the Spanish explorers went up the Orinoco River, it reminded them kind of Venice with these little islands and things like that, and so they call that area Venezuela, a small Venice. Well, my name is Valenzuela, on my father's side, and that, of course, sounds like another important city, and that's Valencia in Spain, which was, of course, the seat of the Spanish colonial empire. And there was quite a few little towns in Spain that were small Valencias, and that's where you get Valenzuela, small Valencia. So that's the nature, that's the etymology of the name. There are all kinds of other theories about it, having to do with suela is also the sole of a shoe, and some people said it's Valenzuela, so it's the cost of the sole of a shoe, but that's rubbish. It really has to do with the fact that the name comes from our geographical designation. So that is an answer to his question. Now, could you clarify
yes, what are the Cubans up to in South America these days?
Well, look,
Tim's substantive question.
Sure. The Cubans, as you well know, suffered an enormous setback with the end of the Cold War. Enormous setback because they were so dependent really on their privileged relationship with the Soviet Union. And when that relationship crumbled, they went into what was called a special period. They continued to try to, it's the only totalitarian state in Latin America, and it's one of the only full totalitarian states that still exists in the world. I still like to go back to Juan Lintz's differentiations between what you might call, democratic regimes, authoritarian regimes, and totalitarian regimes. This is a big, big difference between an authoritarian and a totalitarian regime. Authoritarian regime might, encourages the private sector and all that kind of stuff. You still have very authoritarian rule, but you really have a far more open, civil society and that kind of thing. Cuba is a totalitarian country where the civil society is completely controlled by the state. Your job, your housing, your cash awards for food or whatever are all dependent on the state. At any rate, this system collapses, then the privilege system with the Soviet Union collapses. And so Cuba has been trying to continue to remain in control. And Chavez reached out to the Cubans because of his antipathy against the United States. And we can go into why that existed. I met with Chavez 5 times. I had to deal with this guy when I was at the White House initially, and then later as an assistant secretary. And but Chavez turned towards the Cubans, and he began to be the key source of survival for the Cubans by these huge grants of petroleum, which is how actually the Venezuelans also were able to get much of the Caribbean to follow Venezuela's dictates. I was kind of embarrassed when I was assistant secretary that we didn't really have a really significant aid portfolio to work with the Caribbean. But Chavez was putting hundreds of millions of dollars into Cuba and so on and so forth. So that's where the Cubans were. They were trying to survive, and keep their totalitarian state. And Venezuela did a great favor to them in that sense. They didn't export agents to Venezuela that much. There probably were some. It was mostly doctors. It was mostly, they essentially had 20,000 Cuban doctors, which gave Chavez in Venezuela a lot of grounds to argue that, I'm really helping my people. And so his popularity was based really on a lot of these social programs that the Cubans helped design. But that's what are they up to now? Now they're really in trouble. Again, Cuba is really facing with the collapse of Venezuela is devastating for the Cubans. So that's they don't really have that much influence in the region at all. It's not true that the Venezuelans and the Chileans were behind the protests in Chile. The protests in Chile were really much more a local phenomena. There might have been a few rabble-rousers, but the irony is that the government made that argument. Oh, look, there are foreign agents right here coming in, to essentially, to try to discredit a lot of the opposition elements in the country. And many of them were, by the way, driven by anarchists. Where I'm not in a position to defend a lot of the people who were involved in this sort of thing, because not only did delinquents and narco traffickers and so on sort of get involved, and there were some anarchists and others like that, but it was not a conspiracy that was exported from Cuba or Venezuela, and that's not the origins of this. These were homegrown problems that were really significant.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. The next question comes from Ambassador Dick Holwell, who was, of course, our ambassador in Ecuador. And behind it is a question from Ambassador Charlie Glazer, our former ambassador in Salvador. But let me pose Ambassador Holwell's question first. Please address the situation in Ecuador. Lenin Moreno has restored a constitutional democracy, but there are suggestions that 2 right-wing center-right candidates from Guayaquil will run, and on the left, a former president with a good record and an indigenous leaders will leader will likely run as well. So can you address Ecuador's political dynamic, Arturo?
Well, I appreciate the question. Ecuador, unfortunately, has one of the histories, I guess, of the weakest sort of trajectory of consolidation of democratic institutions. There was one president who was elected 5 times, but he only served 1 term because he was overthrown before the other 4 times, Velasco Ibarra. So this is in fact, you in some ways you have to give credit to Rafael Correa, who was this socialist president. He's really the first president to be able to get himself reelected and to consolidate a certain amount of power. But when I was in the White House, we had to deal with not earlier Bucaram, who was overthrown, and then I had to deal with the resignation of Mawad when I was at the White House, and so on and so forth. So there were a very weak trajectory, really, of democratic institutions. And Correa, got himself reelected, and it was fairly successful in appealing to the people. But he also played the sort of left-wing card that Chavez was playing. And in fact, some of the problems of Ecuador also are linked very directly to Venezuela. They're also linked to another thing that we haven't talked about, and that is the corruption scandals that emerge out of Brazil with the Odebrecht issue. So you had the Odebrecht scandal affected many countries in the region. It affected Ecuador in a significant way. What was behind that? It was Chavez's obsession with not wanting to send the Venezuelan oil, as the country with the largest deposits in the world, to the United States. So he partnered with the Ecuadorians to rebuild one of the refineries and to actually build a new refinery and so on and so forth. For what? So that the oil could be shipped to China and places like that, and not to the United States. And this led then to and this happened in various other places. Lula did the same thing in Brazil as well. And the Odebrecht company in Brazil was very happy to get in on a lot of these sorts of things in exchange, of course, for a lot of bribing and so on and so forth. So this led to a situation. I don't know. We've probably seen in the paper that in Ecuador, the prosecutors now are accusing the former president of significant corruption and theft of government assets and so on and so forth. So this is an issue. Now,
you mean the former President Correa, Rafael Correa?
President Correa, was indicted. In fact, he's still living in Belgium, so he hasn't gone back for it. But he was indicted, and he's been accused of this is not him, but many people in his government, including his the first former vice president, actually, of Lenin Moreno, was also accused of this theft, fraud and corruption. So that underlies some of the difficulties in Ecuador now. Now, there's no question that Moreno has tried to take the country in a different direction, to try to get away from the ideological bent, to try to sort of strengthen, consolidate democracy. He has encouraged the prosecutors that have been carrying on these, but he's still facing the significant problems. Opposition from some of the indigenous groups, opposition from this has been a country very much divided between the power in Quito and power in Guayaquil, and that still remains the case. So I'm a little bit more hopeful about Ecuador than I used to be, but it's still facing very significant challenges.
Thank you. A further question from Ambassador Charlie Glazer. You previously addressed his a question he had about the extent of outside agitators provoking the disturbances in Chile. But How close to the surface do you think the boiling point is currently in Chile? Maybe a bit difficult to judge since we haven't been able to travel internationally for a number of weeks now, and obviously the coronavirus shutdowns exacerbate conditions in every country. But if you were a weather forecaster here, what would you forecast the political climate to be in Santiago?
Well, the unfortunate thing is that that an agreement really was put together. It was reached. It was driven by the political parties, but it had support from some of the groups in some of the parties on the left as well that were involved in some of the protest movements. A group called Democratic Revolution, for example, that now has several seats in the Congress. And they came around, and the demand really was, look, we need to change the constitution that we inherited from General Pinochet, and so a process was put into place where they were going to hold a referendum this month, on a new constitution, and citizens were going to be asked, who do you want to be members of this constituent assembly? Do you want just citizens, or do you want citizens and legislators? Do you want parity, for women and men, and so on? So a series of questions. And then once the referendum was going to take place, then in the elections that are supposed to be held in November, you would have an actual election of a constituent assembly, and the constituent assembly then, if it's approved in this referendum, all of that has been put on hold. That's the problem, So here's where the coronavirus has really made things much more difficult, because Chile is now dealing with the political crisis that had at least a path towards resolution, and a lot of people hoped that would take place, and now a lot of that has been put on hold. The expectation still is that there will be at some point a referendum, that there will be a demand for a constituent assembly, and then the real question is what goes into that constituent assembly. And since my own scholarship deals with things like constitutional reform and sorts of issues, that's the kind of issue that I've been working on, not only in Chile, but also in other countries, having to do with the nature of executive legislative relations, political parties, and that kind of thing. But at this particular point, it's really kind of on hold. This little virus, the revenge, I guess, of the microorganisms of the world against the human species has been pretty serious, And maybe in some cases they go up and they get into your cerebellum and they create some kind of a fascist response. I don't know, but at least or at least the viruses are competing with the bacteria, and they think that they can destroy with the human species. I don't want to be too frivolous about this because this is such a serious thing, but in fact everything is on hold as well in attempting to resolve some of these fundamental problems.
Arturo, thank you. There aren't any further questions in the question queue, but let me ask participants, if you have a question further for Arturo, we have him for a few more minutes, and actually there's no absolutely magical time, about 1 p.m. for stopping this seminar if questioning went on a bit longer. But if there are any further questions, let's see if they pop up here quickly. Arturo, in the question queue. And I'm not seeing any, but as I wrap up, if one pops in, perhaps we can interrupt the wrap up. With that, Arturo, I would like to thank you very much for making your time available this afternoon to speak to us, the members of the Council of American Ambassadors gathered for this virtual roundtable. We haven't figured out a way to deliver virtual lunch so far, but we can at least deliver virtual wisdom and virtual information, thanks to you. And for the other participants in today's roundtable, I'd like to thank you on behalf of Ambassador Chorba, our president, myself, and the staff of the council for joining us in this first foray into a virtual ambassadors roundtable. We hope it was successful and informative and interesting. And I'd like to advise you to keep an eye peeled for the next such announcement, a program with Ambassador Ryan Crocker, the dates for which we are currently working out and which should be announced shortly. We think it will be of high interest to everyone. So with that, a new question has popped into the queue, so let me check and see what it is. Actually, yes, it's a comment from Ambassador Holwell, not really a question. So with that, let us say farewell for today, and please keep your eye peeled for the next announcement of the Council's next virtual roundtable. Arturo, once again, thank you very much for your participation.
It's been an honor and a privilege to join you as well.
Thanks.
All the best, and please stay safe, everyone.
Thank you so much for your good wishes. Bye-bye.